This is a reading from the Holy Shroud and the Visions of Maria Valtorta. The Cross of Jesus. The evangelists do not describe the shape of the cross, but give us a hint when they speak of the inscription that was put on it above Jesus. And Pilate wrote a title also, and he put it upon the cross. And they put over his head his cause written, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." And there was also a superscription written over him in letters of Greek and Latin and Hebrew, "This is the King of the Jews." On that account, it is clear that the vertical beam stuck out above the horizontal one. It was a crux immissa, or crux capitata, as the most ancient fathers thought. St. Irenaeus, for instance, says that Jesus' cross had 4 tips, 2 lengthways and 2 widthwise. St. Augustine held the same view. As we saw, Maria Valtorta declared that Jesus carried an entire cross to Calvary. It was a real cross, well assembled, solid, perfectly fitted in the intersection of both arms, and well reinforced with nails and bolts in the arms. When she described Jesus' sufferings during his 3-hour agony, she also said that the crucified God was able to lever his entire body by pushing with the nape of the neck on the horizontal beam of the cross. His sufferings become greater and greater. The body has the first archings, characteristics of tetany, and every outcry from the crowd worsens them. The death of the nerves and the fibers spreads from the tortured extremities to the trunk. This causes the respiratory movements to be more and more difficult, the diaphragmatic contractions weaker and weaker, and the heartbeats more and more irregular. The face of Christ alternately changes from bright red flushes to the greenish paleness of a man bleeding to death. The mouth moves with greater difficulty because the cramp is being spread, even to the jaws, by the overly tired nerves of the neck and even the head, which together lever the entire body dozens of times, propping themselves against the horizontal beam of the cross. According to Maria Valtorta, therefore, Jesus' cross had the Latin shape, but the 2 beams were not flush. The horizontal one somewhat jutted out from the vertical one, enough so that Jesus could lean the nape of his neck on it, figure 40. The Gospel does not allow us to reconstruct the height of the Lord's cross either. Some evidence, however, suggests that it was fairly tall. St. Matthew wrote, "And immediately one of them, running, took a sponge and filled it with vinegar and put it on a reed and gave him to drink." St. John wrote, "And they, putting a sponge full of vinegar on a stalk of hyssop, put it to his mouth." Jesus' head, therefore, must have been somewhat high above the ground, if it could be reached only with a reed. What St. Luke says is also of interest. Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate and begged the body of Jesus, and taking him down, he wrapped him in fine linen and laid him in a sepulchre that was hewed in stone. Jesus was very probably suspended to a tall cross, known as crux sublimis, used only to draw attention to the one dying. According to a much disputed ancient tradition, the Lord's cross would have been 4.8 meters high, 15.7 feet, and its horizontal beam about 2.5 meters long, 8.2 feet. Maria Valtorta says that the vertical beam of the cross was about 4 meters high, or 13 feet. They carry their crosses. Those of the 2 thieves are shorter. That of Jesus is much longer. I would say that its vertical beam is no less than 4 meters, 13 feet. I see it carried already assembled. We should note, however, that this is only Valtorta's personal estimate. She herself declared, "As for measuring, I'm not worth a thing." Her interpretation, nevertheless, does not clash with the Gospel and agrees in substance with the opinion of many sindonologists and exegetes. According to them, Jesus' cross must have been no less than 3.5 meters high, 11 foot 6. Even Professor Giudica Cordelia could be said to roughly agree with her, because he thinks that Jesus' feet on the cross would have been about 1 meter, about 1 yard from the ground. After Jesus' death, his cross and the crosses of the thieves crucified with him were probably buried near the sepulchre. The Hebrews considered it a serious desecration to bury in the common graveyard those who had been executed, so they used to bury them in a place apart, together with the instruments of their execution. In about AD 125, Emperor Hadrian had a temple to Jupiter built precisely on Mount Calvary out of hatred for Christians. Thus, the places sanctified by Christ's death and resurrection remained hidden under the pagan temple until about AD 325, when Emperor Constantine decreed that it be pulled down and a large Christian basilica be erected on the same place. This work gave St. Helena, Constantine's mother, the opportunity to go to Jerusalem to look for the Savior's cross. She found it, together with other important relics of the Passion, among which was a part of the inscription set up above Jesus' head. Some critics think all this is sheer legend. However, one cannot doubt the authenticity of St. Cyril's letter to Constant, Emperor Constantine's son. St. Cyril, Bishop of Jerusalem, who died in 386, wrote, "In the time of Constantine, your father, the salutary wood of the cross was found in Jerusalem." As time went by, small portions of the Holy Cross would have been sent to various parts of the world for the sake of devotion. The part remaining in Jerusalem ended up as spoils of war in the hands of Khosrau II, Parviz, king of the Persians. In AD 614, in 628, Emperor Heraclius, having routed the Persian army, won it back and personally brought it back to Jerusalem. This return of the cross was afterwards celebrated every year in the Western Church. The Crucifixion and Death of Jesus. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are scattered. My heart is become like wax, melting in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue has cleaved to my jaws. And you have brought me down into the dust of death. For many dogs have encompassed me. The counsel of the malignant has besieged me. They have dug my hands and feet. They have numbered all my bones, and they have looked and stared upon me. They parted my garments amongst them, and upon my vesture they cast lots. Psalm 21, verses 15 to 19. The Crucifixion of Jesus. How did Jesus' crucifixion take place? The gospel account is simple. They took Jesus and led him forth, and bearing his own cross, he went forth to that place which is called Calvary, but in Hebrew, Golgotha, where they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side, and Jesus in the midst. Maria Valtorta says that Jesus, on top of Calvary, was crucified onto the entire cross, lying on the ground. No ropes were used. First his hands were nailed, then his feet, with a single nail, very long, twice as long and twice as wide as those used for the hands. Then 4 executioners raised the cross, dropping its lower end into a hole dug beforehand. All sindonologists think that Jesus' feet were crucified with a single nail, as can be gathered from the shroud's imprints. However, not all agree that the cross was lying on the ground when Jesus was crucified. Dr. Barbet wrote, "Jesus was nailed to the patibulum, the horizontal beam of the cross on the ground. Then he was lifted with it, was placed with his back to the stipes, the vertical beam of the cross, and was lifted up so as to join the patibulum to the upper part of the vertical beam. We may imagine that the operation was made easier by climbing backwards on a short ladder leaning against the vertical beam, as that depicted by Fra Angelico. This is the simplest solution, the easiest one for the executioners, and this, as I said, is an argument of absolute value. With all due respect for the French surgeon, Dr. Barbet, I do not think it would have been the simplest solution. On the contrary, I consider it to be more complicated than the other one. It should suffice to think about this short ladder and the sentenced man's backwards climb on it. No doubt this was one of the many ways of crucifying, but if Jesus carried an entire cross to Calvary, as many are convinced he did, his crucifixion must have occurred as Maria Valtorta described it, and at least 4 tough men were required, not 2, because sentenced men did not usually allow themselves to be nailed that easily. It follows that Valtorta's account does not conflict with the gospel, all the more so because, in practice, The carrying out of a crucifixion was not an unchangeable rite. It depended on the mood of the actual executioners. Unlike Christ, the two thieves crucified with him were most probably fastened to their crosses with ropes, not nails. Monsignor Ricci agrees with this for the following reasons. Jesus, throughout his 3-hour agony, was able to pronounce but few words. During the short times he managed to lift himself up to breathe, pushing against the nail in his feet and pulling himself up with his hands. The two thieves, however, were able to speak freely and at length, as attested in the Gospel. This would not have been consistent with the acutely painful continuous torture of the median nerves injured by the nails. Then their legs had to be broken to avoid that their bodies be displayed on a feast day, as it was only a few hours before the Sabbath began. Such a fact suggests that the executioners foresaw the thieves' agony to be very long, their death being brought about by causes other than asphyxia. Maria Valtorta fully confirms this opinion. She writes that the two thieves, once put in an upright position, scream as if they were skinned alive, tortured as they are by the ropes that cut into their wrists and turn the hands black, with the veins swollen like ropes. Nevertheless, an objection could crop up. If the two thieves were tied with ropes, they could still have breathed and survived even with broken legs. Maria Valtorta, however, adds that after the executioners smashed their knees, they even hit the heart area and clubbed them to death. Afterwards, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, "I thirst." Now there was a vessel set there full of vinegar, and they, putting a sponge full of vinegar on a stalk of hyssop, put it to his mouth. Jesus, therefore, when he had taken the vinegar, said, "It is consummated," and bowing his head, he gave up the ghost. John chapter 19, verses 28 to 30. The death of Jesus. We Christians of the 20th century can scarcely imagine how atrocious and cruel Jesus' death on the cross was. Cruelty-wise, crucifixions outdid everything that we can imagine. It is well known that some men survived a few days on the cross. How could we explain Jesus' quick death in only 3 hours? Some put forward the hypothesis of a rent in the heart, of a severe traumatic pericarditis. Others say that he starved to death. Yet others say that his swallowing the few drops of vinegar or bitter drink offered by the soldiers caused the fatal syncope. Or else Jesus would have died of an embolism or from a severe alteration of his respiratory system. Hynek proposed to the discussion of all the scholars of the world the most likely explanation: death due to tetanic cramps and to suffocation with unspeakable agony and full consciousness. Judica Cordelia assures us that all those hypotheses are laid open to arguments of various kinds. He holds that Jesus' swift death must be attributed to multiple causes. Indeed, the agony in the Garden of Olives, the scourging, crown of thorns, punches and blows with sticks during the various trials, absolute fasting, thirst, and severe blood losses, all that brought about his heart failure. Maria Valtorta does not advance scientific hypotheses, but adds something of great interest. She says that Jesus died above all from the grief he experienced in God's abandonment. It is certain that the Heavenly Father never actually did abandon his Son. Nevertheless, Jesus, as man, would have experienced deep down divine abandonment. He suffered as if he had really been forsaken, thus experiencing the punishment due to those who want and deserve such abandonment. This terrible suffering, which Valtorta claims to have had a share of a few times, would have caused Christ's heart to burst. She wrote, "The avalanches of grief that had already crushed him in Gethsemane start again. The waves of the sins of the whole world start to beat against the innocent, shipwrecked one again, to submerge him in their bitterness. Above all, what starts again is the impression, more crucifying than the cross itself, more conducive to despair than any torture, that God has abandoned him, and that prayers do not rise up to him. It is the final torment, the one that hastens death, because it squeezes the last drops of blood from the pores, because it grinds the surviving heart fibers, because it finishes what the first knowledge of this abandonment had begun, death. Because this is what my Jesus died of, first of all, O God, who have struck him for our sakes. After your abandoning, through your abandoning, what does a creature become? Either a mad person or a dead one. Jesus could not become a madman because his intelligence was divine. And since intelligence is spiritual, it prevailed over the total trauma of the one struck by God. He therefore became a dead man. The dead man, the most holy dead man, the most innocent dead man, he who was life, died, killed by your abandonment and by our sins. Dr. Barbet holds that Jesus died because he wanted to, since he had the power to offer up his soul. The explanation proposed by Maria Valtorta is more satisfying, because it shows the divine Redeemer for what he really is, the great victim. He was made to become sin for us. According to St. Paul's strong expression, he had to be totally consumed. In him, all spiritual, mental, and physical sufferings had to be gathered up for all of mankind's sins to be atoned for. This is a more complete, more majestic, and more authentic view. The descent from the cross. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. Everyone has turned aside into his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was offered because it was his own will, and he opened not his mouth. He shall be led as a sheep to the slaughter, and shall be dumb as a lamb before his shearer, and he shall not open his mouth. Isaiah chapter 53, verses 6 to 7. The descent from the cross. The evangelists, always very restrained, do not describe the details of Jesus' descent from the cross. St. John wrote, "And after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, because he was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave leave. He came therefore and took away the body of Jesus. And Nicodemus also came, he who at the first came to Jesus by night, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. They took therefore the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths with the spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. Now there was in the place where he was crucified a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein no man yet had been laid. There, therefore, because of the parasheve of the Jews, they laid Jesus, because the sepulchre was close at hand." Maria Valtorta, as we already mentioned, speaks of a cross about 4 meters high, 13 feet. She also says that Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, and the young apostle John unnailed Jesus from the cross using 2 ladders. I suppose that they had a few rungs and may have belonged to the same Joseph who owned the garden. Then she says that Nicodemus and John at his shoulders and Joseph at his feet lifted his body wrapped up in the sheet, and also resting on the coats serving as a stretcher, and start on their way down. The fingerprints found by the sindonologists on the heels of the man of the shroud would then be, according to Maria Valtorta, Joseph of Arimathea's. Dr. Barbet, followed by others, supposes on the contrary that the descent from the cross and the carrying of Jesus to the sepulchre would have presumably taken place like this. 1. The feet are unnailed from the stipes, the vertical beam of the cross. There is only 1 nail to pull out from the wood. 2. The patibulum, the horizontal beam of the cross, is lowered with the body without unnailing the hands. Jesus and the patibulum are carried as a whole, without any contrivances, by 5 men. 1 touches the body at the heels, 2 others support the back with the sheet twisted like a belt that becomes soaked with blood. The last 2 hold the ends of the patibulum. 3. The body is set down on 1/2 of the shroud, only at the end of the trip. On the way over, a small quantity of blood coagulated across the skin of the back in the belt's wrinkles. Since these clots, shaped like irregular meanders, are still fresh, they will impress themselves onto the shroud, thus causing the lower back transversal trickle, figure 10. 4. The body is set down on the shroud, probably on the so-called unction stone. At the last minute, the bearers have almost certainly stopped holding the back with the belt, since, drenched with blood, it would have made a large stain on the shroud. 5. The hands are unnailed, at long last, the patibulum is taken away, and the upper limbs are folded, the hands being crossed over the pubic region. 6. The other half of the shroud is then folded above the head, epi ten kephalen, John chapter 20 verse 7, onto the front surface of the body. Honestly, ever since the first time I read Dr. Barbet's La Passione di Cristo secondo il chirurgo many years ago, I have not been able to convince myself that when Jesus' body was carried from the cross to the sepulchre, things would have happened as he thinks. Dr. Barbet is convinced that those who took Jesus down from the cross simply reversed the steps taken by the crucifiers. So far, this is consistent with Barbet's hypothesis, that is, not the problem. However, the Gospels mention the names of only 3 men, friends of Jesus, present on Calvary at that tragic time: John, Nicodemus, and Joseph of Arimathea. If after the earthquake other people had been involved with the burial, the evangelists would certainly have noted it, as they have done for the pious women. Moreover, how could we accept the hypothesis that these 5 men would have carried to the sepulchre Jesus' body with his hands still nailed to the horizontal beam? Being sentenced to the cross was the greatest disgrace, the worst torture that could be inflicted on a man. It would be logical, then, to think that Jesus' friends would have made sure before anything else that their master's body be taken off that dishonorable thing. To see him crucified, even when he was dead, would have given them, especially his mother, the impression that he was still suffering. Besides, why carry all the way to the sepulchre that heavy patibulum? Certainly not to save time. Sooner or later, Jesus' hands had to be unnailed. Dr. Barbet felt compelled to imagine this scene, figure 42, and add 2 extra men to hold Jesus' body in a horizontal position with a twisted sheet, in order to give satisfactory explanation for this strange lower back transversal blood trickle found on the man of the shroud, figure 10. Had it been otherwise, he says that the mixture of blood and water from the pleura, of which a small quantity coagulated across the back when the body was carried, could hardly have ascended from the median line to the left edge, even if the body had been tilted on the left side. But in a horizontal position, this edge was in fact higher than the median line. That means that if the sacred body, once taken down from the cross, had not been held in a horizontal position on the way to the sepulchre, as Barbet thinks, the blood of the inferior vena cava and of the hepatic veins would not have flowed out so easily, and therefore the blood trickle across the lower back of the man of the shroud would not have formed. We may, on the contrary, suppose that it would have formed, though in a different way. Jesus could have been carried to the sepulchre more or less as can be seen on Chiseri's painting, so that no blood could have flowed out of the previously mentioned veins. The lower back transversal trickle could have been formed in the sepulchre, once the man of the shroud had been laid down horizontally on the unction stone. This is more than ever likely, since not all sindonologists think that cadaveric rigidity could have set immediately after death. Dr. Maurizio Maceda, for instance, quoted Professor Rinaldo Pellegrini, who said, "Cadaveric rigidity is usually slow, intense, and drawn out when hardy individuals meet with a violent death." According to Macera, the man of the shroud's cadaveric rigidity occurred when he was already carefully placed in the sepulchre. Sindonologists can see some serum around the blood clots in the small of the back of the man of the shroud. This serum, according to them, is an indisputable sign of a dead man's blood. However, had there been no such serum, I would have been tempted to think that the lower back transversal blood trickle could have been formed in a different manner and time, for instance, on the cross. During the 3 hours of his atrocious agony, whenever Jesus was in a state of collapse, the blood which flowed out of his hand wounds, running down his forearms, trickled down his armpits and sides. It was eventually stopped by the linen wrapped around his hips. There it mixed with the blood from the scourging wounds that were reopened by the tautness forced onto the epidermis and the rubbing against the wood of the cross. There it divides into trickles as it follows the irregular line of the fabric. Once this fabric was removed in the sepulchre, the irregular meanders which impress sindonologists so much would have been left on the skin. This hypothesis would give the phenomenon a satisfying explanation and would show that, in keeping with Jewish modesty, Jesus was not crucified entirely naked. Maria Valtorta wrote, "All of the body weight shifts forward and downward, and the holes are enlarged, especially the one in the left hand. The holes in the feet are enlarged too, while the blood spurts out more quickly. The blood from the feet drips along the toes down to the ground and along the wood of the cross. The blood from the hands follows the forearms, because they are higher at the wrists than at the armpits, on account of the position, and it runs down along the ribs too, as it goes down from the armpits towards the waist." But once the plural mixture of blood and water had of course flowed out of the side wound, when Jesus' body was laid down horizontally, where would it have gone to? It could have been absorbed by the sheet which was used to carry him to the sepulchre, and was immediately afterwards replaced with a clean shroud. That hypothesis, however, is to be absolutely rejected, because sindonologists assure us that the blood of the lower back transversal trickle of the man of the shroud is the blood of a dead man, since it is dark red and surrounded by blood serum, commonly referred to as water.